Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and welcome to my entry into the Invitational category of the Great Guitar Build-Off 2023, which I have named Oscar. Now, that might seem like an odd name for a guitar, but let me explain. It has to do with these barn doors here that I'm disassembling to use for the build. Now, my grandfather bought the land that I live on now, back in the 1930s, and he built a barn where the garage that I'm working out of now stands. And on that barn, he installed these barn doors, which I'm told he got from someone else who was tearing down their own old barn, which dated back to the 1860s. So it's thanks to my grandfather, named Oscar, that I have these doors now that I'm making this guitar out of, and so the guitar is named after him. And so, we've had these barn doors for a really long time, and, ever since we built this garage, they've been sitting in a corner for the last roughly 20 years. And before that, they had been, functioning doors that had been exposed to the elements, for a good 140 years before that. So I knew they were sturdy, but I never really knew what kind of wood they were made out of. So this was sort of an interesting experience, being able to finally take one of them apart and actually find out what it is. And it became apparent really quickly once I started cutting into them here that these boards were cedar, and you could tell right away by the smell. And for those who don't know, cedar actually smells quite pleasant. But it is distinctive, you can't miss it. So this was one of the side beams going vertically up the door. And you can see there are these big voids in it where tenons from the cross pieces were going into it to hold it together. Now, sort of another hint that these doors were going back to the 1860s. They were held together entirely by the joints, essentially. There were no screws, there were no nails, there was no glue. The only metal parts were the hinges and some of the lock mechanisms, which were all on the outsides of the doors. So once those came off, everything else was held together by the wood itself. I mean, you look at this wood, and you can see on the sides it's good, clean wood most of the way through. All of that wear is really only on the surface. So I decided pretty early on that I wanted to maintain that on the outside. This wood is seen a lot, and I thought it'd be somewhat interesting if I could make it so that all 160 years of its life stayed visible on the guitar even after it was done. Which on the one hand means I didn't really have to do any fine sanding, which is nice, but at the same time I had to be really careful working with it because I can't sand out any mistakes. I can't erase any pencil lines I put on it because the surface is so rough you couldn't erase anything on it anyway. So here I've mainly put together the body, but before I go any farther with that, I have to work on the neck, because how the neck sits in the body is going to determine exactly how I position the bridge and the tailpiece and the pickups and everything else. So I'm working on the bridge. I would have said on the screen earlier this was Narra or Amboyna, which I've never actually worked with before, but it is very pretty wood. Very strange to work with too. It's very, very lightweight, which is part of the reason I chose this board to be the neck, because the body was extremely lightweight, being cedar. And I wanted to pick something to be the neck that wouldn't just cause horrible neck dive. And I can safely say at this point, there is no neck dive with this guitar. It's very well balanced and also very lightweight. But getting back to it, this was kind of strange wood to work with because it's very hard, sort of like a rosewood, but working with it felt like working with roasted maple, and that it felt extremely, extremely dry. And here, now that I've mostly got the neck put together, I'm doing some more decorative touches. This is a piece of Corian that used to be the wall of a shower. You can see all of this goo on the back that was sticking it to the actual wall, which I'm going to have to remove before I can actually work with the material itself. But this stuff is surprisingly easy to work with. You know, it's different from wood in that there's no grain to it. You know, like the bandsaw blade there didn't want to wander anywhere, drill bits don't want to wander through it or anything like that. But it also didn't crack, it didn't chip, it didn't do anything weird, it pretty much just worked really nicely. So I cut these thin strips out of it that I'm going to use for binding, and once that's on, I'm also going to cut a few pieces out of it to use as my usual inlay. So a little bit earlier you saw me route the binding channel, and this is just some black super glue holding the pieces in place. So here I'm just going to the router table to route away the excess thickness of the Corian on the sides. I was a little bit nervous going into this because at that point I didn't really know how it was going to react to a router blade. You know, if the blade was going to dig in and rip chunks out of it, or if it was going to splinter, shatter, or anything weird like that, but it worked really nicely. I suppose in a way it's sort of like working with resin, if you're familiar with working with resin. And there are plenty of videos of that out there, but if anyone's actually used it themselves, they would know it. It works pretty nicely with woodworking tools. It just makes a lot of really obnoxious little shavings that are annoying and get everywhere. So here I'm just using a Dremel with a precision router base to take out most of the material where the inlay is going to go, then cleaning that up with some freshly sharpened chisels. And then some more black super glue to hold it all in place. I know some people, when they do inlays, they'll use a hammer, like a little fretting hammer or something like that, to tap the pieces into place. Personally, I prefer using a clamp like this to just give them some nice, even, consistent pressure and squeeze them right down into the routing. So off camera I added in some regular inlay dots and the usual frets. Here we come to the carving, and this is where it's really noticeable for me that this stuff, it kind of works like roasted maple. And for anyone who's worked with that, you know what I mean. It felt almost desiccated, like it was just extremely, extremely dry. So just carving the neck and then also the keel and the volute. And then with that done, just going to do a quick test fit of the neck pocket. And it's a good fit. So here I decided that with the front and the back of the body being old and weathered, it would look kind of weird if the sides were this nice, clean, almost brand new looking wood, so I decided to break out the torch and, well, make it look older, or at least more worn. Now, it may seem like I'm burning it pretty black here, but once I go at it with the wire brush, that's going to lighten up quite a bit. Another added benefit of this is that it meant I didn't have to do much fine sanding on the sides either, which is always a plus. And as is my habit, of course I have to make the headstock match the front of the body. So I got another little piece of the cedar here, and carefully cutting off a 3mm strip off of the more weathered side. And of course having to use the spindle sander to actually get it down to 3mm consistently. And here you'll notice that the video earlier focused a fair bit on a little metal keyhole that I had removed. Now I could have put that back on the body, but unfortunately it would have gone onto the back of the body because the hole on the front, the little holes for the screws were completely worn away, it wouldn't have stuck. But that meant I got to reuse that little keyhole piece as the truss rod cover. I'd also used the torch to try and make the inside of that routing for the truss rod cover look a little more weathered, but that didn't really work out the way I wanted, so instead I'm using some brown stain here just to darken it up. And of course the outside edges of that cedar top piece still looked bright and clean, so decided to go at that with the torch again to make it match the body. And because I felt like it at the time, I put a little burnt burst on the back of the headstock. So what I'm doing here is applying some wood hardener to the surfaces of the cedar. Now I had mentioned this stuff is pretty tough, you know, it survived being exposed to the weather outside for 140 years at least. So, you know, how bad could it possibly hold up to being a guitar? But, you know, playing a guitar, your forearm's going to rub on the surface, the pick is probably going to scratch into the surface. You know, just things like that. I wanted to put a little bit of wood hardener on there just so that pieces of it weren't going to flake off easily. Just generally reinforce the whole thing. Now here you can see the keyhole was fairly well rusted over on the surface, so I decided to take a little sanding block and a piece of sandpaper to it to see if I could make that look a little bit better. And you can see the high spots are brightening up quite a bit, and there's actually a fairly neat little design on there, which is visible now that the rust is taken off of the high parts. So what I'm doing here, in spite of everything, the cedar was still a little bit too soft for the bridge pins to not wiggle when I drilled holes for them, so what I did instead was drill out some half-inch holes here and plug them with some half-inch dowel pieces that I cut from the same wood as the neck. And just carefully paring away the excess with a chisel so it's nice and flush with the surface. And here you can see I've routed the control cavities, and now I need to be able to get wires all the way through. And luckily for me, about a year ago I bought these really long, like airplane drill bits. You can see that one's gone all the way through to where the toggle switch is going to be. And zoom out here, you can see just how long these drill bits are. And this is the I mean business drill bit. Just to make sure that channel is wide enough for all the wires to fit through. Here using some more Corian for the back plates. Now the toggle switch itself was quite tall, so I couldn't actually recess this back plate into the back of the guitar. It has to sit on the surface, so it has also been thinned down. But the back plate for this part of the control cavity is still full thickness and just recessed into the body slightly. And here, working on the headstock, drilling holes for the tuners, you can see that I've slightly recessed the top where the ferrules are going to go. Just because I felt better about that than having those sit directly on the kind of uneven surface of the cedar. And then it's time to glue in the neck. Just using some masking tape to keep the glue from getting into the surfaces of the cedar. And here I'm just applying some matte lacquer. So the wood hardener, part of how it works is that once it's fully saturated the wood, it leaves a weirdly kind of shiny surface, which I didn't particularly want, so I'm putting a matte lacquer over the top so that the whole surface has sort of a uniform look to it. And this will also help protect the wood a little bit more. So you can see here, no real shine anymore. And here's drilling the wire, drilling the hole for the ground wire to the bridge. As is tradition, I have to show that on video or else people are going to think I didn't actually put in a ground wire. So there was the ground wire, you saw it, it happened. And here, the putting in the ferrules for the tuners. They're pretty snug fit in the holes that I drilled, so I'm just using this clamp with some soft bits on the jaws to squeeze them into place. And luckily, before I actually installed the tuners, I remembered that I had to oil the neck still. I'm just putting on some of the Crimson Guitar's penetrating finishing oil. Only doing about 2 coats of this because I don't want a whole lot on there. I just want to protect the wood a little bit. Again, the neck shouldn't need much more of a finish than that, as it is effectively a rosewood and it's pretty durable stuff. And you can see there I also applied some oil to the truss rod cover just to try and prevent it from continuing to rust from the point it's at now. Of course, installing the tuners. And here goes the keyhole for the truss rod cover. Nicely inlaid into the top of the headstock so that it doesn't stick out. And some strap buttons with little leather washers on them instead of the cheap little felt ones. And looking at that surface, you can really see all 160 years that that wood has been through. Of course, at this point I had only roughed in some preliminary nut slots. Now I have to get them to an appropriate depth for actual playability. Of course, doing this means that the top of the nut is going to be quite a bit taller than it actually needs to be, and that can potentially cause issues with the strings binding in the nut when you're trying to tune. So once I've got the slots to the appropriate depth, I'm going to come in here with my leveling beam and lower the top of the nut. And then once that's where I want it to be, it can go in with some sandpaper and get it all smoothed out, round over the corners for comfort. It's that last little bit of shaping that makes the guitar that much more playable. And then I'll finally come in with a couple of different Scotch-Brite pads and really polish it up. And as we near the end, I would like to give a big thank you to Alegree in the UK for providing all of the hardware and electronics for this build as a sponsor of the Great Guitar Build-Off 2023. The pickups I've used here are their Humid Tropics humbucker set. There'll be a link in the description if you'd like to check out what they have to offer. And just a quick little weigh-in at the end here. It comes in at 6 pounds, 14.7 ounces, and a little bit over 3 kilograms.